Warning: viewer discretion is advised. This episode is recommended for mature audiences only. It contains adult language and themes.
This is Reaganism, a podcast dedicated to exploring where the Reagan movement lives today. I'm Roger Zach. I'm your host, director of the Ronald Reagan Institute in Washington, D.C.
On this episode of Reaganism, Rachel Hoff, Policy Director of the Ronald Reagan Institute, speaks with Evgenia Kara-Murza, Advocacy Coordinator for the Free Russia Foundation, about her husband Vladimir's journey from documentary filmmaker to Russian dissident to political prisoner. Evgenia recounts her incredible story of perseverance, activism, and her continued fight for freedom on behalf of her husband and fellow Russians.
Well, hello, everyone, and welcome back to Reaganism. I'm your guest host, Rachel Hoff. I serve as the policy director here at the Reagan Institute, and part of my role is to lead our Center for Freedom and Democracy. And so I join the podcast periodically to speak with guests whose work is relevant to that space. And my guest today, Evgenia Kara-Murza, is certainly fits the bill. Evgenia, thanks so much for joining us.
Hello, Rachel. Thank you so very much for having me. It's a privilege.
Evgenia, your last name, your surname may be familiar to some of our listeners. You're, of course, the wife of Russian democracy activist, documentary filmmaker, and now tragically a political prisoner, Vladimir Kara-Murza. Longtime listeners of our show may be familiar with Vladimir when we hosted him on the podcast in February of 2021, so almost exactly 2 years ago. And you've become kind of a bit of an unlikely democracy, human rights activist yourself now, having stepped into the role of political dissident after Vladimir's arrest in Russia. You serve as the Advocacy Coordinator for the Free Russia Foundation, and I want to talk more about your own role and your work a little bit later in the show. But to start, I wanted to talk about the event that we hosted where you were featured here at the Reagan Institute. Just about a month ago, we hosted a screening of Vladimir's latest documentary called My Duty to Not Stay Silent, which is the remarkable story of a Russian Orthodox priest, Father Adelstein, who continues to fight for freedom in Russia, but also was a freedom of religion activist during President Reagan's time in the Soviet Union. Our listeners can check out that event on the Reagan Foundation YouTube page and watch Vladimir's documentary about Father Adelstein there as well. But Evgenia, to start, I wondered if you might speak with us a little bit about the inspiration that both you and Vladimir have drawn from figures like Father Adelstein and Boris Nemtsov, a democracy activist and political leader in the opposition in Russia's modern history. Tell us some about these figures and how Vladimir and you have been inspired by them.
Well, I took my inspiration from Vladimir, so that's an easy answer. My husband, though, has had many amazing influences in his life, and I'm sure that these people have contributed to him becoming the man he is today. And one of such influences is his own father, Vladimir Kara-Murza Sr., who was one of the first independent TV journalists in the post-Soviet Russia. He worked for all three major independent TV channels, closed one after another by Vladimir Putin when he came to power. All of these channels were closed by 2003. And he was one of the journalists working for the very well-known NTV station in Russia. Another such influence is, of course, Boris Nemtsov. Vladimir has always considered Boris his teacher, and he then became his friend and the godfather of our younger daughter. So the assassination of Boris Nemtsov in 2015, basically in front of the Kremlin, has hit Vladimir very hard. And I know that this is a personal tragedy for him and for our entire family. And I know that you just mentioned Vladimir's documentary about Father Georgy Adelstein. Well, after the assassination of Boris Nemtsov, Vladimir made a documentary about him. It's called Nemtsov, and it's also available on YouTube. And I think that this was a way for Vladimir to spend some more time with his good friend, and to show to the world that even though the Putin regime can physically eliminate a person, it cannot kill his memory. It cannot kill his or her fight. It continues, and it's carried on by other people. And of course, Vladimir has always been influenced by and inspired by Soviet dissidents, whom he knew and still knows personally, many of them. And that was his first documentary, and it's called They Chose Freedom. It's the story of Soviet dissidents, including the 7 who participated in the protest on the Red Square in 1968 against the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia. This is an amazing documentary where you can see these amazing faces. Many of those many of those people are already gone, unfortunately. But you can see Yelena Bonner and Pavel Litvinov, and you can see Viktor Feinberg and Natalia Gorbanevskaya and Vladimir Bukovsky and Alexander Podrobinik and others. This is I very much recommend this documentary to all of those who are interested in the fight for freedom during Soviet times. And my husband has had many interesting influences in his life, and he grew up surrounded by these people, but he has become a force of his own, a force to be reckoned with. And I am so lucky to share my life with someone whom I deeply respect and admire.
His work remains so important, and your work to carry on that work while he can't himself as well. And it's one of my great honors of my career was getting to know Boris Nemtsov and Vladimir when they would come to Washington to visit policymakers here and advocate for democracy in Russia, probably 10, 15 years ago. And it's been inspiring to watch Vladimir's continued advocacy in the aftermath of Nemtsov's assassination. You talk about Father Edelstein and the Soviet dissidents and how Vladimir's featured each of those figures in the documentaries that he's made so far, which are really wonderful films and just inspiring to watch. Talk a bit about Vladimir's own emergence. He was always sort of Boris Nemtsov's kind of right-hand guy, and now after Nemtsov's assassination really sort of came into his own as an activist, as you mentioned as well. Vladimir has not once but twice been poisoned by the Russian regime, and yet despite that, and despite the risks that he was fully aware of to his own safety, he continued to return to Russia. You wrote recently in the Washington Post, you have a great quote, which I'll just read for our listeners. The reason he continued to return to Russia, the reason in each case was simple. He believes that as a Russian politician, he needs to be where people are fighting this regime. He believes that he must assume the same risks and face the same challenges confronted by Russians at home. He believes in his country and his people. He's a patriot, one who believes that the Russian people deserve to be free and that their patriotism should not be ceded to the Neanderthal nationalists and their thugs. So powerfully written and inspiring words of your own. But could you tell us a little bit of the backstory? What were the conversations like when he would return to Russia and sort of make those decisions about his own travel, even after his own poisoning by the Kremlin?
Well, we haven't had those conversations for years, I'm afraid to say, because everything was clear. I know what Vladimir's fighting for. I know what his fight is about. So even though, of course, I am terrified and have been for years, I cannot tell him to just drop it all. I cannot tell him to abandon his fight, because I know that he would not be able to look at himself in the mirror. And I know that he is the man I married all these years ago. He hasn't changed. Had he decided to drop a law, I would realize that this is someone different already. This is not Vladimir. And I don't know. It's just, we are on the Reaganism podcast, and I can think of one quote of Ronald Reagan that I truly like. And he said, "There are no easy answers, but there are simple answers. We have to have the courage to do what we know is morally right." This is what Vladimir has been doing for years. You mentioned Boris Nemtsov and him coming with Vladimir to the to DC to meet with all those policymakers, decision makers. Vladimir has been involved in the Magnitsky campaign for many years, since 2010. And I think that what you're remembering were those visits in the context of this campaign for the introduction of the Magnitsky legislation in the United States. That legislation allows to bring to responsibility, to accountability, human rights violators by freezing their assets stored in Western banks, Western financial systems, and by banning them from entering those democratic countries to enjoy the privileges that these countries provide to their citizens. So that's, I just, this morning I talked to Vladimir's lawyer, and there are developments in Vladimir's case. Nothing surprising, but just this is yet another slight, So in Vladimir's case, there are three names. One is Dmitry Komnov. He used to be the head of the Butyrka prison, where Sergei Magnitsky was held. He was the one who ordered torture against Sergei and then denied him medical care, as a result of which Sergei died in 2009 in Moscow. This Dmitry Komnov ended up one of the first on the Magnitsky list. Several months ago, he became head of Moscow's 5th pretrial detention center, where Vladimir's been held. Another name in Vladimir's case is Bastrykin, whom I'm sure many people know. He's the head of the Russian Investigative Committee. And even though, according to Vladimir's lawyers, the investigative committee should not oversee cases such as Vladimir's criminal cases, high treason, and all of that, for some reason, the Russian Investigative Committee is very much involved in Vladimir's case. The head of the Russian Investigative Committee, Bastrykin, ended up on the Magnitsky list, specifically on Boris Nemtsov's and Vladimir's personal initiative. And so new development is that on March the 6th, there's going to be a pretrial in Vladimir's case, and then a week after that, the actual trial. And Vladimir will be judged by a man who is Podoprigorov, Sergei Podoprigorov. He is a judge of the, used to be a judge of the Tverskoy court in Moscow in 2009. He was the one who unlawfully sent Sergei Magnitsky to pretrial detention, ordered his arrest. And he will be, again, he's one of on the Magnitsky list, very much thanks to Vladimir's efforts. And he will be the one judging my husband for high treason. So I would love to believe in coincidences, but I don't, because I do not believe that coincidences in Vladimir's case are, facts are stubborn things.
Right.
So he is being held and will be judged by two people who ended up on the Magnitsky list thanks to his efforts. And the entire case is being overseen by the Russian Investigative Committee, the head of which, Bastrykin, is also on the Magnitsky list and under sanctions thanks to Vladimir's stubborn work.
Well, Vladimir's work on the Magnitsky Act here in the United States and around the world was so important to him and so important to holding perpetrators of these human rights violations to account. You described for our listeners earlier the premise of the Magnitsky Act. Just to connect the dots a little bit, our listeners probably hear a lot about sanctioning countries, right? Sanctions against Russia, sanctions against Iran, et cetera. But one of the new and very powerful things about the Magnitsky legislation in many countries is that it holds individuals to account. So individuals who are involved in Sergei Magnitsky's death, in Boris Nemtsov's assassination, to allow them to, or force them to face personal consequences for the decisions that they make in terms of their own finances, their own travel, as you mentioned. And so that work is very powerful, but I appreciate you sharing the updates about Vladimir's case. It's, there's almost no situation where he would get a free or fair trial in Russia today, but knowing those personal connections to his own work, of course, I and our audience will be following the updates, but this episode may air right around the time of that pre-trial or the trial. So we'll certainly look for updates and post them in the show notes for our listeners to keep updated with his case as he goes through. And our thoughts and prayers, of course, are with you and your family as he goes through that process as well. One thing, Evgenia, that always struck me in my interactions with Vladimir and even with Boris Nemtsov as a major politician of his time 10, 15 years ago, was that they were always quick to say, no, it's not about me. It's not about us. We're here representing, and advocating, but there are so many people across Russia who face oppression, who face persecution, in fact, who face imprisonment. Vladimir's case is one of many in Russia and around the world. In particular, with the situation with political prisoners in Russia, could you speak with us about sort of the scope of the situation in Russia? How many political prisoners are there in Russia today? What does it mean to be a political prisoner? What types of activities might you be engaging in? You mentioned Vladimir's been accused and charged with high treason, but at a practical level, what might somebody, a Russian citizen, be doing that would land them as a political prisoner in Vladimir Putin's Russia?
Well, Vladimir's case is very illustrative of everything that's going on in Russia, of every way of repression that the regime is using against protesters in the Russian Federation. So Vladimir now has 3 criminal cases against him. The first one is for spreading so-called fake news about the use of Russian armed forces in Ukraine. And that is a new legislation that was adopted in early March, only 9 days after the full-scale invasion had broken out. And under this legislation, a person can go to prison for up to 15 years for speaking out against the war, for spreading information about what is going on in Ukraine, for talking about war crimes committed by the Russian army in Ukraine, for talking about the act of aggression against Ukraine, for anything and even remotely seems as an act of protest. For example, many people have been detained across the country for protesting with a copy of War and Peace in Hands, Leo Tolstoy's War and Peace in Hands, or for protesting with a blank sheet of paper. Several people that happened during the first months after the full-scale invasion had broken out. Several people were arrested in Moscow for protesting, as the official police report said, with invisible anti-government signs. So they were just standing in the street, holding their hands like that. And the police decided that they were holding, that they could see and read those anti-government signs in their hands. I just this morning, I woke up to an absolutely terrifying piece of news about a family in Russia. A girl got detained for drawing an anti-war picture at school. The police came to her home, took her, removed her, and sent her to an orphanage, while her father was beaten up and taken to a pretrial detention center where he's now facing criminal charges. And as he was the only one he was raising his daughter alone, so he will end up in prison and she will end up in an orphanage. Those things are happening in Russia on a regular basis. Over 20,000 people have been detained across the country since last February for protesting against the war and for protesting against the regime. There have been almost 6,000 administrative cases initiated against people for discrediting, as the Russian authorities call it, the Russian army, or spreading fake news. Those administrative cases usually imply a fine or a short prison sentence of 10 to 15 days. But in Russia, this is very often just a step away from the criminal prosecution. So very often the authorities begin by fining a person, and then as a next step, they initiate a criminal case against him or her. There have been 440 criminal cases initiated against people under the same anti-war legislation. And I believe 26 have already been sentenced. One of them, Alexei Gorinov, he's a municipal deputy in Moscow. He got sentenced to almost 7 years in prison for saying during a meeting of the municipal council in Moscow that it was unethical to hold contests, children's drawing contests and dance recitals while kids in Ukraine were dying. For that, he was arrested and thrown in prison for almost 7 years. In his for someone of his age and health, this is not something that, his friends and family and many people are very worried about his health, because his health is deteriorating very fast behind bars. Ilya Yashin got sentenced as well under the same legislation. There is also a Crimean activist, Alexander Tarapov. There is a fireman, a 61-year fireman, Vladimir Rumyantsev, who protested against the war, got sentenced under the same legislation. So that is, 26 people for now, and that number is growing. So the authorities do not only use prison sentences against protesters, but they have actually restored all means of repression that were used in the Soviet times against dissenters. The regime is very widely using torture, punitive psychiatry, rape, and other means of extreme violence against all those who dare say something, who dare oppose the official narrative, who dare just call this war a war. And those cases are absolutely terrifying and mind-boggling, as the case of Maria Ponomarenko, a journalist who was recently sentenced, I believe for 7 years. I hope I'm not mistaken. For 7 years for making a post online on Telegram, I believe, about the bombings of the theater in Mariupol. After spending several months in pretrial detention, she was sent to a so-called evaluation to a psychiatric hospital where she was injected with unknown psychotropic substances. And when she was able to speak to her lawyer after that, she said that she could not remember 3 whole days of her stay at that so-called hospital. After that, she was brought back to the pretrial detention center and was recently sentenced and will now be transferred to a prison colony. Another absolutely terrifying case is that of a young poet, Artyom Kamardin, who was arrested at his place of residence for reading anti-war poetry at an anti-mobilization meeting in Moscow. During arrest, he was raped by a policeman with a dumbbell while his girlfriend was being tortured in the next room. The police were putting super glue on her face and tearing her hair out. Artyom was then denied medical care after that rape and was sent to a pretrial detention center. He's now awaiting trial. He's facing up to 10 years for, as the official police report said, inciting hatred with the use of violence. So he is the one being accused of using violence, and he's now facing up to 10 years for that. So the scope of repression in Russia is terrible. It has affected the entire country. Arrests have now been reported, according to human rights organizations like Ovidinfo and Memorial, from all over the country. In over 300 cities, people have been illegally detained. So this is what's happening in a nutshell.
Well, thank you for sharing those stories. They're all so hard to hear. Each of them is so hard to hear, but so important too. And you know, for our audience, especially in the United States, to understand the scope, the scale, the brutality of what's going on in Vladimir Putin's Russia, and to hear those stories from a journalist to a fireman to a poet to a young girl in her schoolroom, to be the victims of that repression, really does help paint us a picture, and also to build those connections between dissent in today's Russia, and what's going on, what the Russian regime is doing in Ukraine, to hear the stories of everyday Russians standing up and speaking out against that war. I appreciate you sharing all of that. I'd like to just sort of, as we wind down, hear a little bit about your own story as well. So prior to Vladimir's imprisonment, you probably wouldn't have considered yourself an activist or a dissident. What's it been like for you now, traveling the world on his behalf and doing some of that advocacy work? What's it been like for you? You know, was there sort of a new perspective that you gained in doing that work? I imagine it's not something that you ever probably considered yourself doing. That was always Vladimir's work, but tell us a little bit about your own experience in that regard.
Well, this has definitely never been my ambition to become a public speaker, a public activist. I have been working with Vladimir and with different NGOs for years. But I have never wanted to be out in the light, in the spotlight. But seeing what's happening, I am a Russian citizen. I am the wife of a political prisoner, and I'm a mother. And I have been absolutely devastated and broken on so many levels by what's going on in Ukraine, by the fact that this regime, this government, has turned my country into a country aggressor. Yet again, we should say, it is not the first time that Vladimir Putin did something like that. And I believe that what we're witnessing today, this atrocious war of aggression against Ukraine, is only the result of over 2 decades of impunity that he has enjoyed while committing other crimes against both his own people and our closest neighbors. I mean, the invasion of Georgia happened in 2008. The annexation of Crimea took place in 2014. The bombings of Syria, during the bombings of Syria, we witnessed terrible war crimes being committed against civilian population, as we did during the war in Chechnya. So all of these crimes have been committed for over 2 decades. And what we're witnessing today is only the result of that impunity that he has enjoyed, because never, ever before has he faced serious repercussions of serious repercussions to his actions. So now that my husband, a brilliant speaker, a Russian politician, a true patriot, is behind bars, being accused of high treason, being accused of spreading false information about the war in Ukraine, being accused of working with undesirable organizations. And in Russia, anything that has to do with human rights is nowadays considered undesirable. I have to step up. Every single person has to step up and fight, because I believe that every voice counts. And I believe it is my goal now to make sure that these voices, those thousands of voices that have been speaking out against the war in Russia, and whom the regime wants to silence, I just want to make sure that the voices are heard. These voices deserve to be heard, because they are also Russians, and they are showing to the world that not the entire Russian people supports the war and supports Vladimir Putin's policies. And many of them are prepared to go to great personal risks to say no to this regime and to say no to this war. And I believe it is only my duty as a Russian citizen, as the wife of a political prisoner, as a mother, to stand up and fight alongside all of those who are brave enough to say something, to do something. I don't really see that I have a choice here. It is something that I owe to my kids. This is something that I owe to my husband and to myself as a citizen of that country. You know, I've told you a few absolutely terrifying stories about repressions used against protesters. You know, I'm a mother of 3, and my oldest will soon turn 17. Her father's not going to be here for her 17th birthday. But over the last year, over 500 minors have been detained by the authorities in Russia for protesting against the war. And criminal prosecution has been initiated against 9 of them, while they were not even 18. Kids, as I told you, are being sent to orphanages because their parents are considered unable to raise good Russian patriots. As a mother, I will fight for every single child whom the regime wants to silence, and for every single family whom the regime wants to silence, because this is what is happening is atrocious, and it is. I cannot stop. Cannot stop Vladimir's fight. Vladimir's war cannot stop now that he's in prison. It has to continue. And if I have to be that voice, however weak compared to my husband, I will be that voice.
Well, it's certainly not a weak voice. It's a strong voice on behalf of human rights, on behalf of what everyday Russians are calling for in opposition to this regime as well. And so thank you for the work that you're doing, that you're continuing to do. What is it in your mind that, if we can sort of put it in the geopolitical context, what is it the United States can or should be doing to support your work, Vladimir's work, the work of these political dissidents in Russia today, either the government or even everyday Americans who are aware of the scope of the problem in Russia? What can we do to support?
Well, I believe that, first of all, it is very important to understand that internal repression and external aggression go hand in hand, that these are two sides of the same coin. And in order to continue warmongering, Vladimir Putin is trying to do everything he can. His regime, his government is trying to do everything it can to silence dissent within Russia. And despite all those atrocious measures thrown at them, people still continue protesting. And that means that there's a lot of people, probably millions of people in Russia who do not support this regime, but might be too scared to say it. And I understand that fear, knowing what measures, what draconian measures are being used against those who dare protest. So I believe that it is important to understand that in order for Russia to be at peace with itself and its close neighbors, it has to become a democracy. The only way for Russia to finally be at peace with itself and its neighbors is for it to become a democracy. In order for it to become a democracy, there have to be people willing to rebuild the country after the collapse of the regime, because sooner or later this regime will collapse. And I believe that now everything should be done to put as much pressure on the regime as possible to bring forward its collapse. But when it does collapse and the country will be in ruins, if we want to see it as a democracy, we need to make sure that those people who understand what is going on and who are fighting it both inside the country and outside of the country, because hundreds of thousands of Russians have been forced to flee persecution and leave their country, they will be the ones to rebuild the country and to make sure that it is a democracy. In order for them to be there to rebuild the country, the first somehow needs to survive. This is why it is so important to show support and solidarity with that part of the Russian society, Russian civil society, that continues fighting despite all odds.
Yeah, it's inspiring stuff. Thank you so much for being with us today. We like to close each of our Reaganism episodes by asking our guests, the Reaganism podcast overall is about figuring out where the Reagan movement lives today. And from my perspective, the stories that you've shared with us today, there's no place in the world where Reaganism, the Reagan movement, is more connected to what's happening in today's world than people standing up and fighting for their own freedom despite risks, fighting for human rights and democracy within their own countries. And so when we speak about that aspect of President Reagan's legacy, could you share with us, as we do at the end of each of our episodes, your favorite book about President Reagan or your favorite speech or quote from President Reagan, one, two, or all three of those that you may want to share?
Well, I did give you the quote, and I believe that this quote is very fitting because it describes Vladimir very well, and it describes so many other freedom fighters around the world who are striving for freedom and democracy and peace. There are no easy answers. There's simple answers. We all have to have the courage to do what we know is morally right. And for the speech, well, I'll have to go with his 1987 speech at the Brandenburg Gate, of course, because that was so powerful in so many ways. That stand with those oppressed, and that stand for freedom, and that push for democracy and for peace. This is, you asked what the U.S. government can do. It is those principled and strong leaders who are not afraid to tell the truth, or not afraid to speak to dictators, to speak to dictatorial regimes without fear, and to say what they know is morally right, and to do what they know is morally right. This is what changes the world. And that speech also speaks to my heart, because that was the beginning of the end of yet another dictatorial regime, the Soviet one. And we know that he pronounced that address, he made that address in 1987, and the wall began being dismantled only 2 years after that. And in 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed. So this is a very hopeful speech to me, and I want to see something similar very soon.
Evgenia, thank you so much for joining us today on the Reaganism podcast, and thanks everyone for listening as well.
Thank you very much, Rachel. Thank you.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Reaganism. New episodes premiere weekly every Monday on YouTube and all podcast streaming platforms. If you like this episode, be sure to let us know and share with a friend.